You can follow this gentleman here in studio at Dave Simon MMA. He is Dave Simon.
Yes, I am. Strikeforce going down Saturday night, 6 days away now from the final Strikeforce event ever.
End of an era.
It is. The Strikeforce era, the San Jose-based promotion, now done. Nate Marquardt will defend the Strikeforce Welterweight Championship in the main event against Tarek Saffiedine. Daniel Cormier, the winner of the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix, one of the top 5 heavyweights in the world, an undefeated Olympian, will be fighting Dion Staring. Josh Barnett taking on Nandor Galmino. Gegard Mousasi faces Mike Kyle, and Ed Herman comes in from the UFC to Strikeforce for one night only to take on former Strikeforce middleweight champion Ronaldo Jacare Souza.
So he's just there for filler.
Yeah, they needed an opponent for Jacare, and Ed Herman needed an opponent. So the UFC said, hey, Ed, why don't you go to Strikeforce and fight Jacare? It's a big name for Ed Herman. It's a high-profile fight for him, so it made sense to jump over to Strikeforce just for one night only, and then everybody that I just mentioned pretty much should be heading over to the UFC.
All right, and that's going to beef up a lot of these divisions, right? I mean, you're excited about the competition?
Yeah, I mean, you look at guys like Daniel Cormier and Josh Barnett, they're going to beef up the heavyweight division in a major way. I have them both ranked as top 10 in the world, so having them face...
It feels like that heavyweight division was recycling some of those names, right? Now you're going to have some more fight, some more depth to it?
Yeah, it adds a little bit of depth. I think that, we had guys like Alistair Overeem and Antonio Silva already move over from Strikeforce. It was just Barnett and Cormier in that heavyweight division still there. So we've already seen a little bit of the Strikeforce boost to the heavyweight division, but now we're going to have really every top 10 heavyweight in the UFC, so it's going to provide for some exciting fights. Nate Marquardt, the Strikeforce welterweight champion, and Tarek Saffiedine, I think they'll both boost up that welterweight division, although I do expect Marquardt to walk away victorious on Saturday night. A guy like Gilbert Melendez, who's the Strikeforce lightweight champion, there's already talk that he would come into the UFC and get an immediate title shot. So there are a lot of stars in Strikeforce that are going to come over and beef up several divisions in the UFC. It's going to be fun to see new talent in the UFC, and it really will be the best crop of talent that the UFC has ever seen. Their roster, when this Strikeforce thing is all said and done, is going to be better than it has ever been before. They'll have more top 10 mixed martial artists than they ever have before, and it's getting to the point where pretty much anybody who's anybody is fighting in the UFC.
Now, do you welcome this move? Are you going to miss the competition of having it all spread out? Makes your job simpler when you just have to follow one. You follow obviously a lot of different, Bellator and all these others, but it simplifies it for you. But do you like that? Would you rather have multiple successful promotions?
Yeah, I don't know how much it simplifies it. It's not like the UFC and Strikeforce were running shows opposite each other a lot of the time, so it was easy to kind of separate it. I like it as a fan of the sport because we're going to see the very best in the world compete all under the same umbrella, and we're going to have the best fighting the best. So we're going to have very good fights because of this conglomeration. So as a fan of the sport, I like it. I think that if you're a mixed martial artist and you're looking for fights, this might not be a great thing because now you only have the UFC to go to, whereas you had Strikeforce before. But we've talked about this before on the show, Matt. There's Bellator that's up and coming. They have their first show on Spike TV on the 17th of this month, and they have a very solid card. And they're going to be doing shows on Thursday nights, which I think is interesting and should be a little bit different. So, Bellator is becoming a place for people to go. So, it's the end of the Strikeforce era, but it doesn't mean the end of competition in MMA.
Dave Simon talking some MMA with us here on the program. Are any of those fighters that maybe were mainstays in Strikeforce, are any of them lamenting the end of Strikeforce or kind of sad about it, or they're excited?
Yeah, I talked to Daniel Cormier a couple of weeks ago, and he was a little bit bummed out just for the fact that Strikeforce was where he was really born as a mixed martial artist. Strikeforce was where he got his start and where he really grew as a fighter. So I think to a certain degree, some fighters are sad that a place that they've been so accustomed to and that they do enjoy fighting, they like that Strikeforce arena, and they like fighting for the promotion, and it's been a good run for guys like Cormier, guys like Gilbert Melendez. So they are, I think, sad because they'll be a little bit nostalgic for the good old days of Strikeforce. And I think, again, some of the fighters are a little bit sad because this does mean that there is less competition, and that big stage of Strikeforce is no longer an option if you don't want to fight for the UFC. But at the same time, pretty much everyone I've spoken to is excited about the challenges ahead. A lot of mixed martial artists will tell you that if they say they're MMA fighters, not everyone will know what that is. But if you say I fight for the UFC, everyone knows what that is. When I talk about mixed martial arts and I tell people, yeah, I talk about MMA, you kind of get that look where, what is that? And then you say, like the UFC in the cage, and then they understand. So for a lot of these Strikeforce fighters, that name recognition of fighting in the UFC is going to do a lot for their careers. It's going to do a lot for their lives. It's going to pad their bank accounts. It's going to add to their notoriety. And I think it's going to be a good thing for everybody going into the UFC. You now get to fight in the true major league of the sport.
All right, so moving forward now, what's the next big date on the UFC calendar for anything?
The next big date for the UFC will be UFC on FX7. That's the next UFC card, and that'll be in Brazil this month. It'll be Michael Bisping taking on Vitor Belfort, and that one should be going down on January the 19th. I believe it'll be the 19th in Brazil, so that'll be a solid card. The UFC looking very good with that card. Belfort and Bisping. It's been talked about that if Bisping wins, he'd get a shot against Anderson Silva. So that one going on, the 19th of January in Sao Paulo. That'll be on FX in the United States, FX Canada here, and that'll be a big one. And then, of course, UFC on Fox, January 26th. That's another big one. Demetrius Johnson facing John Dodson. UFC flyweight title on the line. And the next big UFC pay-per-view is UFC 156 on Super Bowl weekend, February the 2nd. It'll be Frankie Edgar dropping down to featherweight for the first time to challenge the featherweight champion Jose Aldo. So a lot of fights coming up every Saturday from here on in up until Super Bowl weekend. You're either going to have a Strikeforce, a UFC, or something going on. So keeping me busy. A lot of UFCs happening. Strikeforce this Saturday, UFC the following week, UFC the week after that, UFC the week after that. So starting this Saturday and for the next 4 or 5 Saturdays, you're going to have some fights.
What do you have coming up on Wednesday?
We're going to speak with Sarah Kaufman, who is one of these fighters coming over from Strikeforce into the UFC as
newly created women's division.
Yeah,
yep.
The women's division. Now, Ronda Rousey's going to be that first fight against Liz Carmouche at the end of February at UFC 157. But you have to start moving this division along. You have to start putting fights together. And I had put out on Twitter that I'd like to see Sarah Kaufman make her UFC debut here in Montreal in March 16th, UFC 158. I think it would be the perfect time. She retweeted it. She seems like she's into the idea, and Sarah Kaufman will be joining us on Wednesday night to talk about possibly fighting at UFC 158 and who she wants to fight and when she can, expect to make her UFC debut. As a lot of these women now, they're waiting to see when the UFC is going to start putting them in the octagon, and I think there would be no better time for Sarah Kaufman. She's a Canadian. She's fought at the Bell Center here before for the old TKO promotion. She was successful, so why not have her fight here? She's got a lot of fans in Montreal, a lot of fans all over Canada. I think it would make perfect sense to have her fight here in Montreal.
Yeah, you know something? I would tune in for that. I would actually go and check that out. Canadian, a female.
Yeah.
I think I'd be interested in seeing that. I'm going to listen to that. That's Wednesday night, 11 o'clock, Dave Simon, Ringside Report, and then obviously it'll be podcast as well on the website, ringsidereport.net, or on iTunes, I believe, correct?
iTunes, YouTube, TuneIn Radio app. I think we might be on Stitcher, too. We're everywhere. If it's on the internet, you can probably download us on something.